A 58-year-old electronics technician repaired a rain-soaked man's cell phone for free without knowing he was a technology sector millionaire. When he returned the next day wearing an impeccable suit, she burst into tears, thinking she would be evicted. Secrets hidden in a false wall came to light, and their lives changed forever in a way no one could predict. A story of generosity, innovation, and redemption that transformed an entire city. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like on this video and comment where you are watching from. Rain pounded against the tin roof of Margaret's electronics, creating a symphony of metallic pings that echoed throughout the small repair shop. Margaret Wilson wiped her weathered hands on her faded blue apron and glanced worriedly at the ceiling, where water had begun to seep through in 3 different places. She had positioned buckets strategically, but the March downpour was relentless in the small town of Oak Ridge, Virginia. At 58, Margaret's hands remained steady as they had been in her youth, capable of fixing the most delicate circuit boards and breathing life into devices others had declared beyond repair. The wrinkles around her eyes deepened as she squinted at the disassembled radio on her workbench, a 1985 model that reminded her of better days when her shop had been the heart of technological assistance in this coffee-growing community. "Hold on just a little longer," she whispered, both to the old shop with its leaking roof and to herself. The past 3 years had been increasingly difficult as big chain repair services moved into the region, offering flashy guarantees and corporate backing that her small operation couldn't match. The bell above the door jingled frantically as someone pushed through, bringing with them the smell of rain and desperation. Margaret looked up to see a man in his late 40s, completely drenched, clutching something protective against his chest. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry to burst in like this," he said, water dripping onto her already precarious floor. "My phone, it fell into a puddle, and I have critical information on it that I can't lose." Margaret studied him briefly. Soaked khakis and a plain button-down shirt. Nothing fancy but good quality. His face, though strained with worry, had a kindness to it that reminded her of her late father. "Well, you've come to the right place," she said, offering a gentle smile. "Let me get you a towel and some coffee. It's a terrible day to be caught in the rain." The stranger seemed surprised by her hospitality. "I don't want to trouble you." "Nonsense," Margaret replied, already moving toward the small kitchenette in the back. "Electronics and people both need drying out sometimes." When she returned with a steaming mug and a worn but clean towel, the man had placed his smartphone on the counter. It was an expensive model, the kind Margaret rarely saw in her shop these days. Most locals couldn't afford such luxury. "I'm Thomas," he offered, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Thomas Reynolds, just passing through town when this storm hit." Margaret didn't recognize the name, but something told her this wasn't just any traveler. There was an intensity in his eyes that spoke of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Margaret Wilson," she replied, already turning her attention to the waterlogged device. With practiced movements, she opened her special toolkit, the one her father had gifted her on her 30th birthday, containing instruments she'd never been able to replace or replicate. "This might take some time, Mr. Reynolds. Water damage is tricky." Thomas sipped his coffee, watching her work with evident fascination. "How long have you been doing this?" "All my life," Margaret answered, not looking up from her delicate work. "My father taught me he could fix anything with a wire and a current." Her voice softened at the memory. "He had a shop twice this size on Main Street. People came from 3 counties away to have him repair their equipment." "And you inherited his talent," Thomas observed. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "That and his stubbornness. He always said technology may advance, but the principles remain the same, and so do people's needs." Working methodically, she used a specialized technique her father had developed, gently separating components, applying homemade solution to draw out moisture, and reassembling with a precision that came from decades of practice. An hour passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the persistent rain and occasional rumble of thunder. Finally, Margaret pressed the power button, and the screen flickered to life. "There you go," she said, handing the phone back to Thomas. "Good as new. I've run a diagnostic, and everything seems to be working properly." The relief on Thomas's face was palpable. "That's incredible. What do I owe you?" Margaret waved, her hand dismissively. "Today's not a day for charging, it's a day for helping." She nodded toward the window where the rain continued to pour. "Besides, we could all use a little kindness during storms, whether they're the kind that wet your clothes or the kind that shake your life." Thomas stared at her, clearly taken aback. "I insist on paying you for your time and expertise." "Next time," Margaret replied firmly, "consider it Oak Ridge hospitality." As Thomas reluctantly prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Can I ask why? Most businesses aren't in the position to turn down payment." Margaret looked around her. Small shop. At the outdated sign, the buckets catching rainwater, the stack of unpaid bills partially hidden beneath a repair manual. For a moment, her pride warred with her reality. "Sometimes giving what you can is more important than getting what you're owed," she finally said. "My father taught me that too." Thomas nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "I'll remember that, Miss Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow, if that's all right." "Doors always open," Margaret replied, "at least until the bank decides. Otherwise," she added under her breath as he disappeared into the rain. She had no way of knowing that the drenched stranger with the waterlogged phone was Thomas Reynolds, CEO of Raintech Industries, one of the country's leading electronics manufacturers. She couldn't have guessed that he was in Oak Ridge anonymously, scouting locations for his company's newest manufacturing facility. And she certainly couldn't have predicted that his return the next day would mark the beginning of a journey that would transform not only her failing shop, but the entire fabric of Oak Ridge itself. As the rain finally began to subside, Margaret turned back to her workbench, unaware that the simple act of kindness she had just performed would set in motion events that would eventually resurrect her father's legacy in ways she could never have imagined. When the bell above Margaret's shop door chimed the following afternoon, she was balancing precariously on a stepladder, attempting to seal another leak in the aging ceiling. Her heart sank at the sound. Likely Mrs. Abernathy returning to haggle over the already discounted repair of her microwave. "I'll be with you in just a minute," she called out, pressing the last piece of waterproof tape into place. "Please, take your time, I wouldn't want you to fall." The voice was familiar but unexpected. Margaret turned carefully on the ladder to see Thomas Reynolds standing in her shop, completely transformed from the drenched stranger of yesterday. Today he wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, Italian leather shoes, and carried a sleek black attaché case. His rain-matted hair was now styled professionally, revealing premature silver at the temples that somehow enhanced his authoritative presence. Margaret nearly lost her balance. In her experience, men in expensive suits carrying briefcases meant only one thing for struggling business owners. "You're from the bank," she said flatly, descending the ladder with as much dignity as her trembling legs would allow. "I suppose it was only a matter of time." Thomas looked confused for a moment, before understanding dawned on his face. "No, Miss Wilson, I'm not from any bank." He placed his case on the counter and extended his hand. "I'm Thomas Reynolds, CEO of Raintech Industries." Margaret's eyes widened as she absently shook his hand. Raintech was a household name in electronics. Their components were in practically every device she repaired. "Yesterday's appearance was misleading," he continued. "I prefer to explore potential locations for our facilities without the fanfare. That typically accompanies official visits." "Facilities?" Margaret repeated, struggling to process this revelation. "Here in Oak Ridge?" Thomas nodded, his expression warming. "We're considering establishing a specialized manufacturing center in this region. The climate is ideal for certain sensitive components, and the proximity to the Blue Ridge provides natural cooling opportunities that align with our sustainability goals." Margaret's mind raced, connecting dots and calculating possibilities. A major tech manufacturer in Oak Ridge would transform the local economy. It would also almost certainly put her tiny repair shop out of business entirely. "Congratulations," she managed, summoning a polite smile. The town council must be thrilled. They don't know yet, Thomas replied. Only Mayor Patterson is aware of our interest, and she's been remarkably discreet. He glanced meaningfully around the shop. But I'm not here about that today. With practiced movements, he unlatched his case and removed a folder embossed with the Raintech logo. Yesterday you demonstrated exceptional skill and a philosophy of service that has become increasingly rare in our industry. Margaret folded her arms across her chest. Mr. Reynolds, I appreciate the compliment, but if you're here to offer me severance before you've even broken ground, I want to invest in your business, he interrupted, sliding the folder toward her, and I want to hire you as a technical consultant for Raintech's new consumer repair initiative. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Margaret wasn't certain she'd heard correctly. Excuse me. Thomas opened the folder, revealing detailed diagrams of a modernized version of her shop. Margaret's Electronics would become a flagship proof of concept for our new subsidiary focused on extending product lifespan through skilled repairs rather than replacement. He flipped to the next page showing financial projections, full renovation of your current location, state-of-the-art equipment, 2 apprentices of your choosing, and an exclusive contract as a certified Raintech repair center. Margaret's throat tightened. The numbers on the page were more money than she'd seen in a decade. Why? Thomas's expression grew contemplative. Do you know what percentage of electronic waste is actually unrepairable? Without waiting for an answer, he continued, less than 30%. The rest is discarded due to planned obsolescence or because repair costs are artificially inflated to encourage new purchases. He gestured toward the radio she'd been repairing. Yesterday, I watched you apply techniques I've never seen before, techniques that could revolutionize our approach to product lifecycle. Margaret's skepticism remained firmly in place. 3 decades in business had taught her that nothing came without strings. And what would you expect in return for this investment? Your knowledge, Thomas answered simply. Documentation of your repair methods, consultation on our new consumer-friendly designs, training programs for a new generation of technicians who understand electronics at the component level, not just as disposable black boxes. And my shop, Margaret asked, unconsciously placing a protective hand on her workbench. Remains yours, Thomas assured her. Raintech would be a silent partner. Your name, your rules, your expertise, just with resources you currently lack. The offer was extraordinary, too good to be true in Margaret's experience, yet something in Thomas's earnest expression gave her pause. Why me? She asked finally. There must be thousands of repair technicians with more modern facilities, better connections. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. None who fixed a water-damaged phone in under an hour using homemade solutions and vintage tools, none who refused payment from a stranger during a rainstorm. Margaret felt heat rising to her cheeks. She wasn't accustomed to praise, especially not from corporate executives. I need time to think, she said, closing the folder without examining the remaining details. Of course, Thomas replied, producing a business card from his pocket. Take all the time you need. My direct number is on the back. As he turned to leave, Margaret called after him. Mr. Reynolds? He paused at the door. Even if I say yes, this town has a long memory and a natural suspicion of outsiders bearing gifts. Not everyone will welcome this arrangement. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Including your nephew, I imagine. Jason Wilson has already made his concerns about corporate development quite clear to Mayor Patterson. Margaret wasn't surprised Thomas knew about Jason. Her nephew had become something of a local activist after returning from college, advocating for preservation of Oak Ridge's traditional character against what he called corporate colonization. Jason only wants what's best. For Oak Ridge, she said defensively. As do I, Thomas replied. Perhaps we can convince him that those goals aren't mutually exclusive. After he departed, Margaret sat heavily on her work stool, the folder untouched before her. The opportunity was undeniable, but so were the risks, not just financial, but to her independence and the legacy her father had entrusted to her. The shop phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Ellen from the hardware store next door, her voice vibrating with excitement. "Margaret, have you heard? A big electronics company is coming to town. Mayor Patterson just called an emergency council meeting for tomorrow night. They say it'll bring hundreds of jobs." Margaret's gaze drifted to Thomas's business card. "Yes," she replied quietly. "I've heard something about that." As she hung up, her eyes fell on the old photograph of her father that hung beside the register, Herbert. Wilson in his prime, standing proudly before the original Wilson's Electronics on Main Street. In the image, he was demonstrating one of his many innovations to a crowd of impressed onlookers. "What would you do, Dad?" she whispered to the fading photograph, knowing that the answer might lie somewhere in the lessons he'd taught her, lessons about integrity, innovation, and the courage to adapt without compromising one's principles. The rain had finally stopped, and sunlight now streamed through the freshly repaired patches in the ceiling, illuminating, dust particles dancing in the air, and casting the workshop in a golden glow that seemed to Margaret like her father's silent answer. News of Raintech's impending arrival spread through Oakridge like wildfire in dry brush. By week's end, the town had divided itself into distinct camps, those who welcomed the economic opportunity and those who feared the erosion of Oakridge's agrarian heritage. The town hall meeting had been contentious, with Mayor Patricia Langford, known locally as Mayor Patty, barely maintaining order as residents voiced passionate opinions. Margaret had remained conspicuously absent from the meeting, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by her neighbors. While speculation ran rampant, she spent those evening hours poring over the contract Thomas had left, examining every clause with the same meticulous attention she gave to the most delicate circuit boards. After 3 sleepless nights, she'd made her decision. The renovation of Margaret's electronics began the following Monday. Now, 2 weeks later, she stood amid the controlled chaos of construction, watching as workers carefully removed outdated shelving to make way for modern workstations. Jason, her nephew, observed from the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and disapproval. "You're sure about this, Aunt Mags?" he asked, using the childhood nickname that always softened her resolve. At 28, Jason had his grandfather's jawline and his mother's stubborn idealism, a combination that both endeared him to Margaret and frequently tested her patience. "I'm sure about trying," Margaret replied, checking that the workers were handling her father's old tools with appropriate care. Raintech could have simply bulldozed this place and built something shiny and soulless. Instead, they're preserving it, improving it while respecting its history. Jason ran a hand through his sandy brown hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his mother, Margaret's late sister, that it made her heart ache. "That's what they want you to think. Tech companies are masters at slick presentations and empty promises." Before Margaret could respond, a worker's voice rang out from the back room. "Ms. Wilson, we've found something unusual behind this wall panel." Margaret hurried over, Jason close behind. The worker pointed to a section of drywall they'd removed to run new electrical wiring. Behind it was a small compartment that had been sealed for decades, containing a metal lockbox covered in dust. "That's Dad's old storage area," Margaret whispered, memories flooding back. I'd forgotten all about it. With trembling hands, she took the box and placed it on a nearby table. The key had long been lost, but Margaret knew her father's methods. She located the hidden catch beneath the false bottom of the box, and the lid opened with a reluctant creak. Inside lay a treasure trove of the past, meticulously organized notebooks filled with Herbert Wilson's elegant handwriting, technical, diagrams on yellowed paper, and several prototype devices Margaret had never seen before. Each item was labeled and dated, spanning the period from 1965 to 1990. "Grandfather's inventions," Jason breathed, his earlier skepticism momentarily forgotten as he carefully lifted one of the notebooks. Margaret nodded, emotion tightening her throat. He was always working on something new. He'd say the future was just a problem waiting for the right solution. As they began examining the contents, the full scope of Herbert Wilson's unrealized genius became clear. The notebooks contained detailed designs for energy-efficient circuits, miniaturized components and sustainable manufacturing techniques, concepts decades ahead of their time. One prototype particularly caught Margaret's eye, a tiny device her father had labeled perpetual power cell that, according to his notes, could harness ambient electromagnetic fields to power small electronics indefinitely. "Aunt Mags, do you realize what this is?" Jason's voice had taken on an urgent quality. "These designs, they're revolutionary even by today's standards. This power cell alone could transform portable electronics." Margaret nodded slowly, her mind racing. "Dad always said his work wasn't ready yet, that the world wasn't ready. I thought he was just being perfectionist, but now I wonder." The bell above the shop door announced Thomas Reynolds' arrival for his weekly progress check. He paused. At the threshold, taking in the scene, Margaret and Jason hunched over the old lockbox, surrounded by papers and strange devices. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, approaching cautiously. Margaret looked up, suddenly protective of her father's legacy. "We found something," she said, simply motioning him closer. Thomas examined the materials with growing amazement, occasionally emitting low whistles of appreciation. "Herbert Wilson," he murmured, handling one of the prototypes with reverence. "I studied his published papers in engineering school. His theories on sustainable circuits were considered fringe then, but they've since been vindicated." He looked at Margaret with new understanding. "You never mentioned your father was that Herbert Wilson." "You never asked," Margaret replied. "Besides, his most important work never made it to publication." She gestured to the lockbox. "Until now." Thomas carefully reviewed one of the notebooks, his expression growing increasingly animated. "Margaret, these designs, they're extraordinary. The applications for modern electronics would be revolutionary. Lower power consumption, extended battery life, reduced heat generation." He looked up, eyes bright with possibility. "Your father solved problems we're still struggling with today." Jason stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Thomas and the materials. And what exactly would Raintech do with these inventions? The question hung in the air, charged with implications. Margaret felt the weight of her father's legacy pressing on her shoulders. These weren't just technical schematics, they were Herbert Wilson's gift to the future, a future he hadn't lived to see. Thomas seemed to recognize the gravity of the moment. He set down the notebook and straightened his posture, addressing both Wilson family members with careful precision. If these designs work as described, they could fundamentally change how electronics are powered and manufactured. The environmental impact alone would be significant. Fewer batteries in landfills, devices that last years longer, components that don't require rare earth minerals mined in conflict zones. He paused, choosing his next words deliberately. "Legally, these inventions belong to your family. Raintech could license them, develop them in partnership with you, or simply help you patent them independently. But make no mistake," his gaze intensified, "other companies wouldn't give you those options. If word gets out about what Herbert Wilson left behind, you'll have corporate lawyers descending on Oak Ridge faster than you can imagine." Margaret exchanged a glance with Jason, noticing that some of his hostility had given way to thoughtful consideration. "We need time," she said finally, "to understand exactly what Dad created and what he intended for it." Thomas nodded. "Of course. But I'd suggest moving these materials to somewhere more secure in the meantime." He gestured to the open construction area. "Perhaps my office at the hotel. It has a safe." Jason's suspicion returned instantly. "So Raintech can have exclusive access?" "I don't think so." "Jason," Margaret admonished gently, before turning back to Thomas, "we appreciate the offer, but these will stay with me. However, I would welcome your technical expertise in evaluating their potential." Thomas accepted this compromise with grace. "I understand, and I respect your caution." He reached for his phone. "At minimum, let me arrange for a proper safe to be delivered here today, something fireproof and secure." As arrangements were made, Margaret found herself staring at a photograph tucked into one of the notebooks, her father standing proudly beside a young apprentice she didn't recognize. Both were smiling broadly, arms around each other's shoulders in front of what appeared to be an early prototype of the power cell. She turned the photo over and found an inscription. Herbert and Michael, 1988. Breakthrough. The handwriting wasn't her father's. Thomas, she said suddenly, does the name Michael mean anything to you, someone who might have worked with my father? A shadow crossed Thomas's face. Michael Harrington, he said quietly, brilliant engineer, now CEO of Quantum Tech Solutions, one of our biggest competitors. He hesitated before adding, and someone with a reputation for claiming others' innovations as his own. The implications settled over the room like a fine dust. If this Michael had been her father's apprentice, he might have knowledge of these designs, might even believe he had some claim to them. Margaret carefully returned the photograph to the notebook and closed the lockbox. The renovation of her shop suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the responsibility she now faced, protecting and properly sharing her father's visionary work. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Oak Ridge's tree-lined streets as townsfolk went about their daily routines, unaware that the small electronics repair shop at the edge of town now housed innovations that could change their world. The annual Founders' Day festival preparations were visible in the town square, booths being erected, lights strung between lampposts, a tradition that had continued, uninterrupted for generations. The festival's this weekend, Jason remarked, following her gaze through the window. Mayor Patty always uses it to make her big announcements. Margaret nodded, a plan beginning to form in her mind. Her father had been a private man, but a generous one. He wouldn't have wanted his inventions locked away, but neither would he have wanted them exploited. Thomas, she said finally, her decision made. I'd like to discuss a conditional partnership, one that honors my father's work while ensuring it benefits more than just corporate interests. As the three of them began to negotiate terms, none noticed the figure watching from across the street. A man in an expensive suit, speaking quietly into a cell phone, his attention fixed on the activity inside Margaret's electronics. Michael Harrington had not come to Oak Ridge by coincidence, and he had not come alone. Oak Ridge's Founders' Day festival transformed the small town into a tapestry of twinkling lights, local crafts, and the rich aroma of coffee from surrounding plantations. Margaret moved through the crowded square, acknowledging greetings from townsfolk who seemed evenly divided between supportive smiles and wary glances. The discovery of her father's innovations had remained a closely guarded secret, known only to Margaret, Jason, and Thomas, or so she believed. Margaret Wilson, I thought you'd be too busy with your corporate makeover to attend our little community celebration. Mayor Patricia Langford's voice carried the artificial sweetness that had characterized their interactions since high school, when Patricia Jenkins had defeated Margaret for class president by spreading rumors about her strange, reclusive family. Now in her late 50s, Patricia had maintained both her perfectly coiffed appearance and her talent for veiled hostility. I wouldn't miss Founders' Day, Patty, Margaret replied evenly. My family has attended every year since my grandfather helped establish the festival. The mayor's smile tightened as she smoothed her designer blazer, an unnecessary gesture meant to draw attention to the contrast between her polished appearance and Margaret's practical attire. Yes, well, traditions change. Speaking of which, she lowered her voice conspiratorially, I'm making a rather significant announcement tonight that might impact your arrangement with Rain Tech. Before Margaret could respond, Thomas appeared at her side, offering a glass of the festival's signature apple cider. Mayor Langford, he greeted with professional cordiality, I was just telling the Chamber of Commerce how impressed I am with Oak Ridge's community spirit. Patricia's expression transformed instantly into what Margaret recognized as her campaign smile, broad, practiced, and entirely devoid of warmth. Mr. Reynolds, I was hoping to catch you before my speech. I have excellent news about our additional incentive package. Perhaps we could discuss that later, Thomas suggested smoothly. I'd hate to take you away from your constituents during the festival. As Patricia reluctantly moved on to greet other attendees, Margaret turned to Thomas. What did she mean about an announcement that would affect our arrangement? Thomas's expression darkened. I'm not certain, but there have been rumors about Electrofix establishing a presence in the region. Electrofix? Margaret's stomach tightened. The repair chain was notorious for undercutting local shops. Offering quick but low-quality repairs at prices independent technicians couldn't match. They're a subsidiary of Quantum Tech Solutions, Thomas explained carefully. Margaret made the connection immediately. Michael Harrington. Thomas nodded. Grimly. It seems too coincidental. The festival's public address system crackled to life, announcing that the mayor's address would begin in 15 minutes. Margaret scanned the crowd, spotting Jason deep in conversation with a group of local farmers. His animated gestures suggested he was still campaigning against corporate influence, despite his grudging admission that Thomas's intentions might be more nuanced than he'd initially believed. I need to show you something, Margaret said suddenly, leading Thomas away from the festival lights and toward her shop. It couldn't wait until tomorrow. Inside Margaret's electronics, the renovation was nearly complete. New workbenches with state-of-the-art equipment stood alongside carefully preserved vintage tools. The space somehow managed to honor the past, while embracing the future, exactly what Margaret had hoped for. She unlocked the new safe Thomas had provided and removed a notebook she'd been studying closely since its discovery. I've been reviewing Dad's notes on the power cell, she explained, opening to a page filled with complex calculations. There's something he was concerned about, an application he specifically wanted to prevent. Thomas leaned closer, examining Herbert Wilson's meticulous notations. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he read. Military applications, he murmured. Your father realized the cell could be modified to create a power source for a new generation of undetectable surveillance devices. Margaret nodded solemnly, and according to his journal entries, that's exactly what Michael wanted to develop. Their partnership ended because Michael wanted to pursue military contracts, while Dad believed his inventions should improve lives, not intrude on them. Thomas straightened, processing this revelation. This explains why Herbert never published his later work. He was preventing misuse, not hiding his genius. And now? Margaret asked quietly. What happens when the world learns what he created? Before Thomas could answer, the shop's door swung open. Jason entered, his face flushed with urgency rather than his usual indignation. Aunt Mags, you need to get back to the festival, right? No. Mayor Patty's about to announce a major economic partnership with Electrofix. They're planning to open their regional headquarters where the old mill stands, right across from your shop. Margaret felt a cold realization wash over her. She's trying to undermine our project before it even launches. It's worse, Jason continued, uncharacteristically, including Thomas in his concerned gaze. Michael Harrington is with her on the stage. They're framing it as bringing authentic tech repair back to Oak Ridge after what they're calling the corporate takeover of a beloved local institution. Thomas's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He checked it quickly, his expression hardening. My team just found unusual activity in our secure servers. Someone's been attempting to access our collaborative project files, specifically the scans we made of Herbert's designs. Margaret's mind raced, connecting pieces of AI puzzle she hadn't realized they were solving. Michael must have learned about the discovery somehow. He's making a preemptive move against us. But how would he even know? Jason asked. Margaret's gaze fell on the construction crew's sign-out sheet, noting a name she didn't recognize among the regular workers. We've had dozens of people through here during renovations. Any one of them could have reported the discovery. Thomas was already typing rapidly on his phone. I'm implementing emergency security protocols and alerting our legal team, but that won't address the immediate public relations challenge. The festival, Margaret realized. Patricia's using Oak Ridge's most important tradition to turn the town against us before we can reveal what we're actually planning. The distant sound of applause filtered through the windows as Mayor Langford likely took the stage. Time was running out. Jason, who had remained skeptical of Thomas despite their tentative truce, made a surprising decision. We need to stop her. All of us. He looked directly at Thomas. "I may not trust corporations, but I trust Michael Harrington and Mayor Patty even less." Margaret felt a surge of determination as she carefully returned the notebook to the safe. "I've spent decades hiding in this shop, letting Patricia's version of events define public perception. Not anymore." The three hurried back toward the festival, formulating a rapid response strategy. As they approached the town square, they could hear Patricia's amplified voice extolling the virtues of Electrofix's community-centered approach to technology repair. And unlike certain corporate interlopers, Electrofix understands Oak Ridge values, the mayor was saying to mixed reactions from the crowd. "That's why I'm proud to announce that Michael Harrington, CEO of Quantum Tech Solutions, and a longtime admirer of our community, has committed to preserving local jobs while bringing cutting-edge expertise to our town." Michael Harrington stepped forward, a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference. Margaret recognized him instantly from the photograph with her father, though the intervening decades had transformed the eager young apprentice into a calculating business titan. "Thank you, Mayor Langford, for your visionary leadership," Michael began, his rich voice projecting easily across the square. "When I learned that outside corporate interests were attempting to exploit Oak Ridge's resources, including the legacy of my dear friend and mentor, Herbert Wilson, I knew I had to intervene." Murmur rippled through the crowd at the mention of Herbert's name. Many older residents still remembered Margaret's father with respect and fondness. "Herbert and I worked closely together for years," Michael continued, skillfully rewriting history. "He entrusted me with his vision for accessible, ethical technology, repair. Today I'm honoring that trust by establishing Electrofix as the continuation of Herbert Wilson's legacy." Margaret could contain herself no longer. "That's not true," she called out, pushing her way toward the stage with Thomas and Jason close behind. The crowd parted, creating a path as Margaret approached the podium. Michael's confident smile faltered momentarily before recovering. "Margaret," he acknowledged smoothly, "it's been far too long. Your father would be proud to see his daughter continuing his work, even on a small scale." The condescension in his tone ignited something in Margaret that had lain dormant for decades. The fierce pride and integrity that Herbert Wilson had instilled in his daughter. "My father would be appalled to see you claiming his legacy while planning to exploit his inventions in ways he specifically rejected," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent square. Michael's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do," Margaret countered, addressing the crowd rather than Michael. "My neighbors and friends, many of you knew my father. You know he valued integrity above all else. What you don't know is that we recently discovered his hidden innovations, technologies he kept secret because he feared they would be weaponized rather than used to improve lives." The crowd's attention was now fully captured, the festival's jovial atmosphere transformed into something more consequential. From the corner of her eye, Margaret could see Patricia shifting uncomfortably at this unexpected disruption to her carefully orchestrated announcement. "Herbert Wilson refused to pursue military applications for his inventions," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "That's why he and Michael parted ways, not as friends, but as ideological opponents." Michael stepped forward, his charm giving way to barely restrained anger. "These are absurd allegations. Herbert never completed those designs. They were theoretical at best, practically unfeasible." "Is that why you've been trying to hack into Raintech servers?" Thomas interjected, joining Margaret at the front of the crowd. "To steal unfeasible designs?" A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the gathering. Mayor Langford attempted to regain control, tapping the microphone sharply. "This is hardly the appropriate venue for corporate espionage accusations," she said tersely. "We're here to celebrate Oak Ridge's future with Electrofix." Jason stepped forward, addressing his fellow townsfolk directly. "Is our future really with a company that's trying to undermine local businesses through underhanded tactics? I've been skeptical of Raintech's presence here. Many of you know that. But at least they've been transparent about their intentions, and respectful of our community's heritage. An elderly man in overalls raised his voice from the crowd. Herbert Wilson fixed my first television back in '72. Wouldn't take a penny. More than he quoted, even though the job took him 3 days. He pointed a weathered finger at Michael. Never mentioned having no apprentice named Michael, neither. Because I worked with Herbert in Charlottesville, Michael countered smoothly. At the university research lab. My father never worked. At any university lab, Margaret replied, her certainty unshakable. He was self-taught and proud of it. Every innovation he created came from that shop on the edge of town. Thomas stepped forward, addressing the crowd with the confident authority that had built his company. Raintech came to Oak Ridge because we recognized the value of this community's approach to craftsmanship and sustainability. We've invested in Margaret's shop not to exploit it, but to learn from it and to preserve Herbert Wilson's legacy of ethical innovation. He turned to face Michael directly. Unlike others who seemed determined to appropriate that legacy for military applications, that Herbert explicitly rejected, Michael's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. You have no proof of any of this. Actually, Margaret said quietly, producing a small device from her pocket. We do. The object in her palm was unmistakably her father's work, handcrafted, metal housing with Herbert's distinctive soldering pattern. This is the prototype for my father's perpetual power cell. According to his notes, you tried to take it when you left, but he had already hidden the real one, leaving you with a non-functional replica. Michael's face drained of color, confirming her words more effectively than any verbal response could have. Oak Ridge deserves better than empty promises and stolen innovations, Margaret continued, addressing her neighbors rather than Michael or the mayor. My father believed that technology should serve people, not exploit them. That's the legacy Raintech has committed to honoring through our partnership, not just with words but with actions. As if on cue, Jason unfolded a large blueprint and held it up for all to see. This is what Margaret and Raintech have actually been planning, not just a renovated repair shop, but a technical training center that will teach the next generation of Oak Ridge residents the skills Herbert Wilson valued. Real repair expertise that extends the life of products instead of encouraging wasteful consumption. The crowd's mood was shifting palpably, muttered conversations and nodding heads indicating growing support for Margaret's position. Mayor Langford, sensing the changing tide, attempted to salvage the situation. While this all sounds very community-oriented, she said with forced brightness, Electrofix offers proven job creation and immediate economic benefits without the uncertainty of an untested training program. An unexpected voice spoke up from the crowd. Ellen from the hardware store, Margaret's neighbor for over 20 years. Pat Langford, we all know you've had it in for Margaret since she turned down your offer to buy her property last year for that condo development you had planned. This isn't about economic benefits. It's about your ongoing feud with the Wilsons. The mayor sputtered indignantly, but the damage was done. The crowd's sympathy had clearly shifted toward Margaret, their hometown technician who had repaired countless treasured devices over the decades. Michael Harrington, recognizing defeat when he saw it, began a strategic retreat. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding, he offered smoothly. Quantum Tech would never wish to create division within such a close-knit community. Mayor Langford, I believe we should reconsider the timing of our announcement. As Michael attempted to exit gracefully, a small commotion at the edge of the gathering drew attention. Her town deputy was escorting someone through the crowd, one of the construction workers who had been working on Margaret's shop renovation. Ms. Wilson, the deputy called out, we caught this fella trying to break into your safe. Said he was working for Quantum Tech on special assignment. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The attempted server hack had been a diversion. The real target had been the physical notebooks themselves. Michael Harrington's carefully constructed facade collapsed completely. Without another word, he turned and strode rapidly away from the stage, ignoring Mayor Langford's confused calls. After him. As the festival crowd buzzed with excitement over the dramatic turn of events, Margaret found herself surrounded by neighbors offering support and asking questions about her father's innovations and the training center plans. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen by her community, not as the eccentric repairwoman on the edge of town, but as Herbert Wilson's worthy successor and a guardian of his ethical legacy. Later that evening, as the festival lights twinkled against the darkening sky and townspeople danced to the local band's music, Margaret sat with Thomas and Jason at a quiet table near the coffee stand. "It's not over," Thomas warned. "Michael won't give up easily, especially now that he knows the designs actually work." Margaret nodded, watching her neighbors celebrate with a newfound appreciation for their resilience. "But we're not facing him alone anymore." Jason, who had spent the evening deep in conversation with Thomas about sustainable manufacturing methods, raised his coffee cup. "To Herbert Wilson," he said solemnly, "whose legacy is in better hands than even he could have imagined." As they toasted, Margaret felt the weight of decades of solitary struggle lifting from her shoulders. Her father's innovations would finally reach the world, not as weapons or tools of surveillance, but as the sustainable, life-enhancing technologies he had always intended them to be. And Margaret herself had been transformed as surely as her shop had been, not by erasing her past, but by embracing it as the foundation for an unexpected future. 6 months after the Founders' Day confrontation, Margaret stood on the sidewalk outside her transformed shop, watching as workmen carefully installed the new sign. Wilson Innovation Center gleamed in brushed steel letters above the original Margaret's Electronics sign, which had been lovingly restored rather than replaced. The juxtaposition perfectly captured what they had created, a bridge between Herbert Wilson's legacy and the technological future he had envisioned. The spring morning was perfect, with cherry blossoms drifting across Oak Ridge's revitalized Main Street. The town had changed subtly but significantly in recent months. Raintech's presence had brought an infusion of energy without overwhelming Oak Ridge's essential character. New faces mingled with lifetime residents, many of them students at the technical training program that now occupied the renovated second floor of Margaret's building. "What do you think?" Thomas asked, joining her on the sidewalk. His usual corporate polish had softened slightly. During his extended time in Oak Ridge, his custom suits now occasionally replaced by quality casual wear, his rigid schedule allowing room for community events and long walks through the surrounding countryside. "Dad would have loved it," Margaret replied, emotion making her voice slightly unsteady. "Not just the sign, everything." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Together, they had transformed Herbert Wilson's hidden innovations into a series of patented technologies that were already reshaping the electronics industry's approach to sustainability. The perpetual power cell, refined and tested, was powering a new generation of medical devices that never needed battery replacement. Herbert's circuit designs were reducing energy consumption in everything from smartphones to industrial equipment. Most importantly to Margaret, these advances had been achieved while honoring her father's ethical boundaries. Raintech's legal team had created unprecedented patent protections that specifically excluded military applications, a revolutionary approach that had initially shocked industry analysts but was now being cautiously adopted by other technology firms. "The first graduating class starts their internships next week," Margaret remarked, watching a group of students exit the building, engrossed in animated technical discussion. "Jason says 3 of them are already designing modifications to Dad's recycling process." Her nephew had undergone perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. After witnessing Michael Harrington's attempted theft of Herbert's innovations, Jason had channeled his activist energy into ensuring the Wilson legacy benefited both the environment and the community. Now he served as the training center's director, merging traditional repair techniques with cutting-edge sustainable design principles. "Speaking of Jason," Thomas said, checking his watch, "we should head to the coffee plantation. He's meeting us there with the investors at 11. The aftermath of Michael Harrington's public disgrace had been swift and severe. Quantum Tech's board had forced his resignation amid allegations of intellectual property theft and corporate espionage. Their attempts to distance themselves from the scandal had created an opening that Thomas and Margaret had skillfully exploited, convincing the board to invest in Oak Ridge's redevelopment as a demonstration of their renewed ethical commitment. Today's meeting would finalize arrangements for a coffee processing facility that used Herbert Wilson's energy-efficient heating system, creating additional jobs while reducing the environmental impact of the region's primary agricultural product. As they walked toward Thomas's electric car, one of several now seen around Oak Ridge, Margaret reflected on how differently events might have unfolded had she not offered free repair service to a rain-soaked stranger less than a year ago. "Have you decided about the conference invitation?" Thomas asked as they drove through town, passing the former mill that now housed a rain-tech research lab staffed primarily by local residents. Margaret smiled, still amused by the notion of herself as a keynote speaker. "I'll go," she said, having finally resolved her internal debate. "Dad's work deserves to be shared with the world, and I'm the one who needs to explain why his ethical boundaries were as important as his technical innovations." The International Sustainable Technology Conference in Boston would be Margaret's first time addressing a global audience, and her first flight in over 30 years. The thought still made her slightly anxious, but the importance of the message outweighed her discomfort. "Amelia's looking forward to showing you around MIT afterward," Thomas mentioned, referring to his daughter, who had initially been skeptical of his Oak Ridge adventure, but had since become one of its most enthusiastic supporters. With her background in corporate strategy and genuine respect for Margaret's technical expertise, Amelia had helped refine their business model to ensure both profitability and social impact. At the coffee plantation, they found Jason already leading a tour for the potential investors. The largest plantation in the region had been in the Johnson family for generations, and Rebecca Johnson, its current owner, had eagerly partnered with the Wilson Innovation Center to implement Herbert's energy-efficient processing methods. The SECOM system reduces energy consumption by 68%, while actually improving flavor extraction, Jason was explaining as they approached. "It's a perfect example of how sustainable technology can enhance quality rather than compromising it." Margaret watched with pride as her nephew fielded complex technical questions with confident expertise. He caught her eye and winked, momentarily, resembling his grandfather so strongly that it took her breath away. As the investors continued their tour, Margaret found a quiet moment with Rebecca, whose grandmother had been one of Herbert Wilson's closest friends. "Gran would have loved seeing all this," Rebecca remarked, gazing across her flourishing plantation. "She always said Herbert was a genius who cared more about people than patents." She wasn't wrong, Margaret agreed. Dad measured success by impact, not income. "Speaking of impact," Rebecca said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "have you heard about Mayor Patty? The recall petition has enough signatures. There's going to be a special election next month." The mayor's alliance with Michael Harrington had severely damaged her political standing, particularly after investigative journalists uncovered evidence of questionable financial arrangements between them. Her subsequent attempts to take credit for Raintech's positive influence on Oak Ridge's economy had struck most residents as transparently hypocritical. "Ellen from the hardware store is running," Rebecca continued. "She's already talking about creating a technology heritage district to honor Herbert's contributions to the town." Margaret shook her head in amazement. Dad would have hated all the fuss, but he would have loved Ellen's practical approach to governance. As the group reconvened for lunch under the shade of century-old coffee trees, Thomas discreetly showed Margaret an email on his tablet. The board of directors had unanimously approved their proposal for the Herbert Wilson Foundation, an independent organization that would ensure his ethical framework guided the application of his technologies long after the current principals had retired. The foundation would be headquartered in Oak Ridge, but would fund sustainable technology initiatives worldwide, with a particular focus on communities typically overlooked by major tech development. Margaret would serve as its first chairperson, with Jason and Amelia as co-directors after her retirement. "It's really happening," Margaret whispered, momentarily overwhelmed by how far they had come from that rainy afternoon when she had fixed a stranger's phone for free. Thomas squeezed her hand gently in understanding. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had anticipated, a partnership that transcended business, built on mutual respect and shared values. Whether it might develop into something more remained an unspoken possibility, one that neither felt pressured to define or rush. After lunch, as the investors departed with commitments secured, Margaret, Thomas and Jason walked to the highest point of the plantation, where a vista opened to reveal Oakridge nestled in its valley. The town looked much as it always had, church steeples and historic buildings mingling with newer structures, surrounded by the agricultural land that had sustained it for generations. But now, solar panels gleamed on many rooftops, and a sense of renewed purpose animated the community. "I received a letter from Michael's attorney yesterday," Thomas said, breaking the contemplative silence. "He's dropping all claims to Herbert's innovations and issuing a public apology." Jason raised an eyebrow skeptically. "An attack of conscience?" "More likely a recognition of legal reality," Thomas replied. "Our documentation is irrefutable, and he's still trying to salvage what's left of his reputation." Margaret nodded, finding she no longer harbored anger toward her father's former apprentice. Michael forgot the most important lesson Dad taught, that innovation without integrity is ultimately hollow. As they headed back toward town, a soft spring rain began to fall, not the threatening downpour of their first meeting, but a gentle shower that nourished the land and cleared the air. Margaret tilted her face upward, welcoming the cool droplets. "1 year ago exactly," she remarked, suddenly remembering the date. "That's when you came into my shop, soaking wet with a waterlogged phone." Thomas smiled at the memory. "Best phone. Damage I ever experienced." Jason laughed, having heard the story countless times but never tiring of its significance. "All because Aunt Mags follows Dad's old rule. Today's not a day for charging, it's a day for helping." The phrase had become something of a motto for the Wilson Innovation Center, emblazoned on a plaque in the entrance and incorporated into their training philosophy. Acts of generosity and integrity weren't just morally correct. They were the foundation upon which sustainable business could be built. That evening, the three sat in Margaret's renovated apartment above the shop, reviewing plans for the upcoming academic term. The space had been thoughtfully modernized, while preserving the character Margaret loved. Herbert's old armchair still occupied its place of honor by the window, now complemented by ergonomic workstations and energy-efficient appliances powered by his own designs. On the wall hung a newly commissioned portrait of Herbert Wilson, painted from Margaret's favorite photograph. Beside it, an interactive display showcased the global impact of his innovations: medical devices extending lives in remote regions, communications systems connecting previously isolated communities, agricultural improvements, increasing food security in challenging climates. To think, Margaret mused, scrolling through the impact metrics, all of this might never have happened if that safe had remained hidden behind the wall. "Or if you charged me the standard rate for water damage repair," Thomas added with a smile. Jason raised his coffee cup in a toast to small kindnesses with big consequences. As they clinked cups, Margaret felt the presence of her father's spirit in the room, not as a ghost but as a legacy made manifest through their shared commitment to his vision. Herbert Wilson had never sought fame or fortune, only the knowledge that his work made lives better and the world more sustainable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: patent applications to file, curriculum adjustments to approve, expansion plans to evaluate. The path ahead wasn't without obstacles. Corporate competitors were already attempting to circumvent their ethical restrictions, and political headwinds occasionally threatened their progress. But tonight, in this moment of quiet celebration, Margaret Wilson knew with absolute certainty that she had honored her father's legacy in the most meaningful way possible. Not by keeping it to herself, but by sharing it with a world that desperately needed his wisdom and vision. Outside, the gentle rain continued to fall on Oakridge, washing away the last remnants of winter and nourishing the seeds of innovation that had found unexpectedly fertile ground in this small coffee-growing town. Within Margaret's shop, those seeds had already blossomed into something remarkable: a future where technology served humanity rather than the reverse, exactly as Herbert Wilson had always intended. And it had all begun with a single act of kindness on a rainy afternoon. When a talented repair technician with a generous heart had chosen to help rather than charge, a decision that had sparked a chain reaction of positive change that would eventually touch lives far beyond the boundaries of their small town. As Margaret laid out her notes for tomorrow's training session, she smiled at the simplicity of it all. In the end, the most powerful circuits weren't those etched in silicon, but those created between people who shared a vision of technology as a force for good in the world. That was Herbert Wilson's true legacy, and now at last it was flourishing,